Thank you, Alex. I'm so excited to be here with you today. This is a really fun topic, and it's great to look out on people enjoying Alabama food as I speak. So I wanted to start actually today with a little personal story. In 2007, as Alex mentioned, I was a student at Auburn, a grad student, and I was fairly new to the state. I was studying rural sociology with a minor in economic development. I did my thesis in the Black Belt on heritage tourism. And I became convinced that Alabama needed a civil rights trail, something that would connect all of these amazing civil rights sites and civil rights history to each other. Because there are so many amazing sites, but the signage is not, uniform. And so I took it upon myself to do that project. I found some funding. I went all over the state. I read every book I could about the civil rights movement in Alabama. And I came up with this manuscript. I had all the pictures. I sent it off to University of Alabama Press, and they called me and said, we love what you've done, but we already published a book like this. So what about a different kind of trail? What about a gardening trail? And I thought, no. What about a sports trail? What about a food trail? And so at that point I had, a decision to make. Was I going to take a deep breath and pivot and go toward this food trail idea, or was I going to be upset that I had spent a year or two on this big important project that would never see the light of day? So obviously I said, okay, I can do this. Let me just start from where I am. And I wanted to share that story with you today because a lot of people say to me, oh, you wrote a book, I could never write a book, it's such a big project. And so I wanted to be very clear that I started with absolutely no idea what I was doing. I knew very little at that time about Alabama, although I was trying to learn more every day. I didn't know what shape the book would take. I was thinking about what about a food trail? That's where it started. And I had enough curiosity to follow all these different ideas and all these different foods sort of down all these different paths. But I assume that in this audience and in an audience like this that there are more than one of you who are interested in writing, it doesn't have to be a whole book even, but writing a story or telling a story about Alabama people and Alabama history. And so I wanted to be very clear that everyone in this room is capable of doing that. If I am, certainly. So I started with a huge list. I asked everybody, okay, let's make a big list about Alabama foods. I started with, 30 or 40 foods, and I just started digging into them. And Google, well, there was Google back then. It wasn't as good as it is now, but Googling and going to festivals and finding out everything I could about all of these foods, looking for foods that truly had an Alabama story to tell. And so that's kind of where I landed with the concept on this book. I didn't want to do a cookbook because I felt like that had been done really well already by a lot of people. And I didn't want to do a food travelogue because I felt like that had already been done. I really was interested in the history and the culture part of it, and so I wanted to look at the food and use the food as a way to find out more about Alabama history and Alabama culture. So use each food as a way to tell these different stories of Alabama. So that's kind of where I landed. So I just want to show you kind of how that played out. Y'all don't see that, do you? Okay. There we go. Okay, it's just like delay. Okay. So the very first chapter, I'm not going to go chapter by chapter, so don't be afraid. But I do want to start with the first chapter, which is corn. Because even though we think about King Cotton and cotton as king in Alabama, I'm here to tell you truly that corn is king in Alabama. First of all, it revolutionized Native American life in the Mississippian era. It turned Native Americans from nomadic to agrarian societies, reorganized all of society, and we had the second largest of those communities in Moundville. So using corn was a way to tell that story of that period. But then also, of course, when Europeans arrived, they learned from the Native Americans how to use corn, and corn was really the sustenance of life in Alabama for hundreds of years. It was present at every table, at every meal, in a lot of different ways. It was used, the husks were used for household tools. The first thing a pioneer did when he got to his new land in Alabama was plant corn. I mean, corn was everything. It was used as currency. It was used as alcohol, as we know. So it had all kinds of uses. So corn is a way to tell that story. But then, of course, we have really significant Native American history in Alabama as it relates to the Creek War as well. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which Andrew Jackson was involved in, which allowed him to become president. And the presidency allowed him to push through Indian removal in 1830, which dramatically changed the face of Alabama and the South for all time. And that's a local story with huge national implications. And so by looking at a food like corn, you can tell that story as well. And perhaps most importantly, you can tell the story of the Porch Creek Indians, who are descendants of the Creeks, and kind of were off the radar for about 100 years because of so much discrimination. It really wasn't prudent to self-identify as Native American. And then I got to sort of interview them and do the research and learn about how they slowly reclaimed their heritage. And so this is a picture taken at the Porch Creek Thanksgiving powwow in Atmore, Alabama. The Porch Creeks are the only federally recognized tribe in Alabama and have the only federally recognized reservation. So if any of you find yourselves without plans on Thanksgiving or the day after, I highly recommend checking out the powwow. It's an amazing thing. And of course, corn is the signature dish at the powwow, roasted corn, and the green corn ceremony is the most important ceremony in the Porch Creek year. So just by looking at a thing like roasted corn, you've got all those stories kind of surrounding it, and all those stories woven into the first chapter. So you have to start with corn. Okay, now I told you I wasn't going to go in order, but this is actually the second chapter, which is gumbo. And gumbo is important because really the definition of Southern food is its blending. So it's got Native American ingredients, African American ingredients, and European ingredients. And that's what Southern food is. That's why it has its own special identity, because of that blend. And so no food really shows that better than gumbo, which has ingredients from the Canary Islands, the Caribbean, France, Spain, of course, the indigenous seafood in the Gulf Coast, shrimp, crab, oysters. And in this book, I use gumbo, too, to tell the story of Creole culture on the Gulf Coast. So all along the Gulf Coast, Mobile, Biloxi, and Pensacola, they had this particular Creole culture that evolved out of the Spanish and French and Catholic traditions, which makes Mobile, I know this won't shock any of you, different than the rest of the state. So Mobile is always kind of beating to its own drum, and that's why, because they have very different origins than the rest of the state, different settlement patterns. And so with a dish like gumbo, you can really see that history and that sort of that Creole history that was very different than the rest of the state. And Creole and gumbo itself is still the signature dish of Creole heritage and African American heritage on Mardi Gras. And so this was taken with Dora Finley, who has passed, but she was a pillar of the Black community in Mobile, and let me cook gumbo with her one Mardi Gras, which was a great experience. Okay. So the next one is fried green tomatoes. I went into this book knowing that I would have to do fried green tomatoes. I would have to find a way to do it. Fried green tomatoes and laying cake, those were my two requirements for myself. And so, of course, we have the wonderful Fannie Flagg history of this book and the subsequent movie, but that's not really enough to form a whole chapter around. So what this chapter ended up being about was sort of what Southern food truly is and has been across the years. So I grew up in Minnesota, but I had a dad from the South and all of my grandparents from the South. So I always kind of lived in these two worlds. And it was interesting to me what the rest of the nation thought of the associations that came up when they thought of the South, like fried chicken and front porches and cotton. I mean, it was just so basic. But really, when you think about Southern cooking and Southern eating, it's all about vegetables. When you look back, every generation spent most of their time in association with food, planting, harvesting, processing, cooking. We mostly, Alabamians, are descendants of farm families. That was the reality for most of us. And vegetables in season and fresh were the heart of the Southern diet, even though fried chicken and barbecue are very important to us. Really, if you ask me, I would say vegetables are the most important thing about the Southern diet. And of course, as you know, the biggest meal of the day was served at noon, and it consisted of lots of different kinds of vegetables and cornbread, of course, and maybe some meat, but maybe not. And so that chapter really let me kind of talk about, what Southern food truly is and what Alabama food truly is. And of course we have the Fanny Flag part too, which is great. And then the next one is boiled peanuts. So boiled peanuts, also like corn, can tell a lot of different stories. I ended up using boiled peanuts to talk a lot about the sharecropping and tenant farming history of Alabama, and of course about George Washington Carver, who is my personal hero of all time. And the extension system, of course, Carver and extension were all about crop diversification at a time when the soil desperately needed it and the economy desperately needed it. And Carver and his fellow extension agents would plead with farmers to plant crops that would give nitrogen back to the soil, like sweet potatoes and like peanuts. And they weren't super successful at first, but in the Wiregrass region, they embraced planting peanuts because really didn't have much of a choice because of the boll weevil. So the boll weevil came through, destroyed the cotton crop, and the Wiregrass farmers said, well, what have we got to lose? So they planted a bunch of peanuts. The timing was perfect because peanuts were on the rise. Consumption was on the rise nationally. Following the Civil War, it had been growing and growing. Both Union and Confederate soldiers ate a lot of peanuts, and they brought that sort of preference home. And so peanut production was up. And in 1917, Enterprise produced, and the area surrounding it produced 1 million bushels of peanuts, which was the largest harvest in the nation. And so that's why Enterprise has the boll weevil statue, in thanks to the boll weevil for destroying their cotton crop and allowing them to diversify. So that's an amazing story to be able to tell. But the other story that I told through this chapter was a story of black land ownership, which despite discrimination and violence and unfair, lending practices, African Americans managed to buy quite a bit of land, and by 1910 they owned 15 million acres in the South. And that's the point at which it starts to decline, though, because of all the things that I just mentioned, because of the Great Migration. And so African American land ownership slowly starts to decline from its peak in 1910, in the 1960s, with big ag and policies that were not good for small farmers. That becomes even more challenging. And so by the time I met Al Hooks here, who is a farmer in Macon County, Alabama, the same county, of course, where George Washington Carver worked at Tuskegee Institute, he was the only full-time black farmer in Macon County. So all the other full-time farmers were white, and all the other black farmers farmed part-time. So just kind of interesting to think about the changes that had happened even in his generation. And so that boiled peanuts tells a lot of different stories, and those were the best boiled peanuts I've ever had in my life. Okay, and the other thing that I really looked at when I was looking at these foods and trying to decide what to include and sort of following all these stories down the rabbit hole is I really wanted to get away from those kind of stereotypical Deep South images that we have and find the lesser known stories of Alabama, the ones that we just don't hear about as often. And so the first one I discovered in my very own city were the banana docks, which I can tell you as a resident of Mobile, Mobilians don't know a lot about. But so after cotton collapsed, so it's like 1890 in Mobile, and the city is just flat on its back. And the Chamber of Commerce wanted to boost the economy through imports. So they offered a $1,500 incentive to the first ship from Central America that would carry fruit into Mobile. So that happened in 1893, and the ship was carrying bananas. And they just kept growing and growing. And 7 years later, by 1900, Mobile was actually the third largest banana importer in the nation, behind New York and New Orleans. So it was, for those of you who have been in Mobile, I mean, the banana docks took up like 4 blocks downtown along, where Government and Dolphin Streets end, huge warehouses, all this infrastructure, and we don't really even know about it today. And so that was one of those kind of Alabama stories that I discovered, looking for stories that are a little bit off the beaten path. Another one is the town of Bayou La Batre. Of course, we are all familiar with Biola Battery and Forrest Gump. I saw Forrest Gump. I caught it on TV the other day, and I happened to see the scene where they talk about Biola Battery, and they pronounced it perfectly. I was so impressed. Anyway, Biola Battery has a fascinating history all the way through. It started at the turn of the century, right around 1900, believe it or not, as a resort area. There were a few posh hotels. There was a medicinal spring. There's a railroad that brought wealthy Mobilians to the water. This is 25 miles south of Mobile, right on the water. And then there was a terrible hurricane in 1906, and then another one a decade later, and another one a decade later. And so the hotels were destroyed, and that whole industry basically shut down, and the bayou became a seafood town. And that's really what it was for many decades. Now it's seafood and shipbuilding. So these are shrimp boats, but shrimping becomes even more and more difficult as the years go on. And so that's part of the story. But also, Biola Battery has a population of Southeast Asian immigrants who started arriving in the early 1980s from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And so Southeast Asian immigrants are not a group that we tend to think about when we think about Alabama. And so it was really important to me that we recognize that there's a whole group living in the bayou. There's Buddhist temples, there are Asian grocery stores, and this is a whole community in this area. And of course, the other story that the shrimping chapter tells is the story of Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil spill, whose effects are still alive and well in the bayou today. So that's another kind of off the beaten path story that we don't hear every day. I also discovered the existence of BBQ Clubs. I think that Sumter County is the only county in Alabama that have these particular kind of barbecue clubs. It's very odd. No one really understands why just Sumter County. But there you are. And so they don't, as far as I know, the barbecue clubs they're very competitive, and they reside in the smallest towns in Sumter County. Now, Sumter County is a rural county anyways, but there was one club that decided they needed to just split off and form their own because they didn't want to travel the 6 miles that it took to go to the other one. So this is a very rural phenomenon. Livingston, the biggest city in Sumter County, doesn't have a club. So that gives you a clue that this has really rural roots. And a lot of the food traditions that we enjoy today were ways to get rural people together. So we're all, on the farm, If you think about barbecues that are cooked long and slow, lots of time for fellowship. Cane grindings and syrup making, fish fries. I mean, all of these sort of bring us together for long periods of time. And the barbecue clubs do the same. The men still gather to pull the meat. They just come together every month for a club dinner, and everybody brings sides, and it's just a nice, good time. But it's so interesting that they just exist in this one county. Similarly, we have a chicken stew tradition in Alabama. It's a particular kind of chicken stew, and it exists in 6 or 7 counties all the way to the north. So 3 or 4 counties in Alabama and 3 or 4 counties right over the line in Tennessee. And that's a very localized tradition. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And then the other thing that I stumbled upon, which is one of my very favorite things to learn, were girls' tomato clubs. Has anyone ever heard of girls' tomato clubs? Just out of curiosity. Okay, this was one of my favorite things. So, of course, they had boys' corn clubs before they had girls' tomato clubs. You know they did. So this was an extension project, and they formed these boys' corn clubs to help teach kids in hopes that they would convince their parents to diversify the crops, always back to this. And then someone said, well, we could teach the girls too. And so they formed girls' tomato clubs. They started in South Carolina in 1910, and they spread throughout the South. Girls ages 12 to 18, and by 1917 there were 32,000 girls involved. And so they were teaching them to plant, to cultivate, to harvest, but also to make a business plan, to market, to think about their profit and their margins. So if you think about this time period, these were really awesome and progressive skills for girls to have. And so they were judged on their quantity, their quality, and their profit. And they would compete, and then of course they would also hopefully convince their parents to grow some other things. So I thought that was a really interesting slice of history. And the other thing that I tried to do with these stories, they all had to have a really strong Alabama tie. There are a lot of foods out there and a lot of stories, but I wanted this to be an Alabama book. So every chapter really had to be telling an Alabama story. But I also, of course, found stories that even though they were Alabama stories, they had sort of national implications. And one of them was the Lane cake. So, invented by Emma Rylander Lane in 1898, published in her cookbook called Some Good Things to Eat. She was in Clayton, Alabama at the time. The Lane cake was mentioned in To Kill a Mockingbird. It was actually made the state cake of Alabama in 2016. And so it's ours. So I knew I had to include it. And I am telling you, I dug so deep on Emma Rylander Lane, and I could come up with nothing. She is a very mysterious woman. And so if anybody else can find out anything about her, please tell me. She's originally from Americus, Georgia, and those librarians probably won't let me in the door if I ever die. I just was trying to find out about her, and I couldn't find anything. And so it was a similar situation, like, okay, I know I have to do this chapter, but how? I was like Facebook messaging her descendants. It was shameful. So finally, I said, okay, back up a step. So she publishes this cookbook, Some Good Things to Eat. She self-publishes it in 1898. And what does that mean? Why did she do that? Why was that important to her? And that was really the question that flipped the whole thing, because as it turns out, at that time, American women were writing cookbooks like crazy. They were fed up with the French cookbooks, which were had expensive ingredients, they were complicated, they were vague, they were esoteric, they were French, So they said, forget it, we're going to write our own cookbooks, and they are going to be easy to understand, They're going to be comprehensive. These were massive work. They had thousands of recipes. We're going to tell people how to do everything. Organize their kitchen, grow a kitchen garden, recycle. I mean, you know, household remedies. Their idea was we're going to give these, you know, homemakers, so most women are at home at this time, real life tools to run their households efficiently and economically. So there's this whole wave of cookbook writing. So that's interesting, but the coolest part about it is that at the same time, women have more time on their hands because of technological advances. The housework isn't as hard anymore. They're having about half the number of kids that they had in 1800, you know, right around 1900. The kids are going to school, so they're not, you know, home teaching them all the time. And so, of course, what do women do when they have time on their hands? They don't sit around, I'll tell you that much. So they start making clubs, and they make literary clubs, and then they start making clubs. And it's actually, when you look back in the history, called the Women's Club Movement, where they start all these clubs to help society, mostly focused on issues around family and children. A lot of education reform advocacy, a lot of treatment of juvenile offenders, a lot of work around that. And so through this work, with the writing cookbooks and organizing all these clubs to help their communities, that's kind of where women get the confidence and the skills and the connections that they needed to eventually advocate for women's suffrage in the 1915 to 1920 period. So all of that from the Lane cake, I just had to, you know, work hard to find it, but so that was one of the most enjoyable chapters to write, because it is such an Alabama story. I mean, Alabama women had these clubs and they wrote these cookbooks, but it also has such a national resonance. I mean, this was happening all over the country. Another one, this is a Montgomery story. So sweet potatoes are a food of survival in the South. African Americans were used to yams in West Africa. When they were enslaved here in the South, they substituted sweet potatoes and used them the same way. When you put sweet potatoes and collards together, you get most of the nutrients you need to stay alive. So sweet potatoes were really a food of life, a food of survival. They grow anywhere. You can bank them in like a mound of dirt, and they'll last over the winter. I mean, this was a really important food in the South. And so Georgia Gilmore, whose name probably many of you know, she was an African-American woman in Montgomery who started something called the Club from Nowhere. And she sold cakes and pies to support the Montgomery bus boycott. She would sell them all over the city, including sweet potato pie, which was sort of a staple. And she would donate all of her proceeds back to the movement to help with car repairs and the taxi system and everything. And she also had a restaurant in her home, which she didn't call it a restaurant, but she cooked in her home in the Centennial Hill neighborhood. And she cooked on a 4-burner stove, and she cooked all of the food that we think of as being traditionally Southern. And her home became a gathering place for the leaders of the movement to meet and to strategize and to plan, but also to just enjoy each other's company, have fellowship. The food was nourishing, the conversation was nourishing. And so this concept of a restaurant where people were coming together to nurture sort of body, mind, spirit, and soul is where the concept of soul food sort of slides in. And soul food is part of the broader soul movement. But it's part of looking back to your past and being grateful, but also looking ahead. And it sort of reflects the courage, but also the tenacity. And so all that stuff is wrapped up in an experience like people were having in Georgia Gilmore's home. And there were restaurants like that across the South. There were restaurants that were operating in just the same way in Memphis and Birmingham and Atlanta. And so that's why this story, even though it's super local, sort of reflects something broader that was going on in the nation. So eventually, Martha Hawkins, who runs Martha's Place, I'm sure many of you, maybe all of you, have eaten there. This is her hand. Unfortunately, I only have her hand in this photo. She heard about Georgia Gilmore when she was thinking about opening her restaurant. I think it was the early 80s, and they ended up talking on the phone, and it was that spirit of sort of coming together over a warm, sustaining home-cooked meal that she took into her restaurant when she opened it as well. And so this chapter tells a little bit about Martha and her story also. And then the last one that I felt like was a great national story was sweet tea. I started talking to Milo of Milo's Tea, his family, his wife and his granddaughter, and I realized that Milo's life really kind of ran alongside the life of Birmingham, the city where he's from and where he grew up during the Great Depression and World War II. Birmingham was one of the worst hit cities in the nation in the Great Depression, which I didn't know before I started digging into it because it was so heavily dependent on industry. When those jobs disappeared, it was terrible. And because they lived in the city, it was harder to grow their own food. So just the poverty and the disease, people out of work, people hungry, was really excessive in Birmingham. And so by telling the story of Milo's Tea and his family, I was able to tell the story of the city and, of course, the WPA projects and World War II industries that eventually sort of booted that city back out. So that was kind of a fun one to tell, too. Obviously a national story, but with really deep Alabama roots. Okay, so I have a few minutes, and I just want to talk a little bit. So these are the four, you guys can read that, I guess, yeah. These are the 14 foods that I ended up with. So I wanted to talk a little bit about process. They were hard decisions to make. You know, you can't include everything. I could write this book probably 10 more times with 100 more foods, you know. But I was trying to be mindful of geographic diversity. For example, I really wanted to include oysters, but I already had gumbo and shrimp, which are both seafood and both Gulf Coast chapters, and so I felt like that would tip it too heavily to the Gulf Coast, and I tried to be mindful of racial and cultural diversity as well. So I wanted to make sure to include the Gulf Coast, the Wiregrass, the Black Belt, the Appalachian region, Birmingham, Montgomery, Mobile. I wanted to be mindful of chronological diversity. I wanted the frontier stories, but also the civil rights stories, the women's movement stories, the early history. So I tried to give a pretty good spread, and then I tried to put them in chronological order, which was a challenge because they all spread in all kinds of crazy directions. But and then, of course, I wanted a food diversity. So I wanted some meat and vegetables and seafood and desserts, and I had the beverage in there. I have a chapter on wild turkey, which is the bird and not the liquor. There's been a lot of confusion, Okay, so still, even though when I found the 14 foods, it was still challenging to think about how much to cover. I think the hardest thing when you write nonfiction is making decisions about what to leave out and what to put in. And so I had a great early reviewer who read one of my first drafts and said, you know, since this is a book about Alabama history, I'm not sure you need to go back to like the prehistory of the potato in 5000 BC and the Andes. It sounds very obvious now, but I was like, you know what, you're right. So she or he said, why don't you try starting the food journey when it comes into Alabama and then go from there. So that was really critical advice, and anyone who reads the book will be thankful for that. But then also, you know, I have all these ingredients. So if it's not the main food, but it's an ingredient, do you do a sidebar for every ingredient? I mean, how much do you really want to know about the biology of the wild turkey? I read an entire book on it and I was fascinated, but I don't know as a regular reader. I mean, how much do you want to know? So it was a lot of discussion, and it was also challenging to include topics like the Montgomery bus boycott, the voting rights movement, barbecue. These are topics that have been covered and covered brilliantly, and so that was another challenge as well. The other best piece of advice I got this was from my editor, was to include what he called a journalistic piece in every chapter, so a first-hand account of the food. So I did go turkey hunting twice. I did not see this turkey. I did not see any turkeys because they are very crafty, I learned. But I did hear them, and I had an absolutely wonderful adventure. And what I learned through turkey hunting was that turkey hunters, and this seems obvious again in hindsight, are huge naturalists and huge conservationists. They give tons of money to conservation in Alabama. And in fact, the whole conservation movement started with sportsmen across the nation. Hunters were going out and realizing that all these species were disappearing, and they're the ones really that pushed for game laws across the United States and certainly in Alabama. So that was a really fun and interesting thing to learn. I also cooked chicken stew at 4 o'clock in the morning in February in North Alabama. It was very cold and dark and really fun. I was with the East Limestone Volunteer Fire Department. So another thing that's important when you write a book like this is to really be shameless. Like I did so much cold calling and so much just popping up in random places, and I was welcomed at every turn, which was really heartwarming. So they didn't know me from anybody, but they were happy to let me cook chicken stew with them. So these are some of the stew jars. They put them in these huge jars. You can't tell how big they are, but. And then also I went to a decoration day on Sand Mountain. Again, just started calling churches on Sand Mountain until one said, yeah, you can come, I guess. So I showed up, and that was a really fun, sweet day as well. And it was good to get that experience because that was my Appalachian focus. And so Decoration Day is a very Appalachian tradition, and it was, I thought, an interesting way to do fried chicken. Fried chicken is hard to do uniquely because it's been done so many times. So that's the fried chicken chapter. So what I want to leave you with today, really, like I said at the beginning, there are so many stories out there. I mean, they're just story after story after story, and we will never be able to tell them all. Our state is so rich and so diverse in every way that you think about diversity, biodiversity, cultural diversity. I mean, it's all there. And so I want to end by encouraging all of you to help tell our stories. If you want to write a book, that's awesome. If you don't, even just writing an op-ed or starting a neighborhood publication or, getting the kids to go interview some people. I mean, I worry because I know how many stories are out there, and I know that every day we're missing them. And so I'm just calling on y'all to help collect those and tell those and share those. And these are stories of everyday people. I mean, everyone in this picture besides George Washington Carver, true American hero, is just a regular person going about their day. And I mean, these are all of you. And so I think sometimes we think we have to find, something extraordinary, but what I found through this book was really the power of all these very regular, ordinary people. So that's where I want to end it today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.
We have some time for questions, so if you'd like to just raise your hand, we can pass you a microphone, and then you can ask the question.
Would you give us an example or examples of some foods you left out?
Yeah. So oysters was one of them. Biscuits, collards, catfish. Rightfully so. People have very dramatic opinions about collards. Catfish, peaches. Yeah, there's a lot.
There's a question.
Yeah. Tell us where, I'm right here.
Like, look.
Tell us what the roots of the moon pie are.
So the moon pie is a Tennessee food. Is made at the Chattanooga Bakery, which originally made tons of different items, and then eventually the moon pie was so popular they stopped making anything else, and now they only make the moon pie. So the reason that the moon pie is interesting to Alabama is because it's the most popular throw during Mardi Gras in Mobile, and they don't throw it in New Orleans. And Mobile's real touchy about being the first Mardi Gras, and they're very annoyed by New Orleans pretending to be the first Mardi Gras. And so the moon pie really makes Mobile. It sets Mobile apart. And so I tried to discover who the first person was to throw the first moon pie off of a float, because people have been throwing stuff off floats, for, 300 years. And it is a hotly debated topic. There are about 5 or 6 people who claim to be the first person to throw a moon pie off of a float. And so I just include all of the stories in the book, and it was precipitated by a ban on throwing Cracker Jacks, which you can imagine throwing a box of Cracker Jacks into a crowd is a terrible idea. And people were getting hurt by the corners, and so people were looking for something soft to throw and catch. And a lot of people think that they threw it first, but because there are so many parades, it's possible that everybody sort of started throwing it, at the same time. So I leave it up for debate. I wasn't about to wade into that. Argument.
There's one in the second row right here.
Have you considered doing a digital version that includes all the information you found, including going back to the Incas?
Oh, that would be a dream. I don't know if anyone besides you or I would read it, but I love that idea. I do want to tell you, too, I thought Foster might be here, but some of you might know Foster Dixon, who is a teacher at Booker T. He's the director of the creative writing program. He did a curriculum guide that accompanies, and he was going to try to make it here to tell you all about it. So I'll just, he's here. He was here. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed him. So it's for 10th and 11th graders, and so for those of you who are teachers or know teachers or have teachers in your lives, please pass it on. It's a free downloadable PDF. It's on Foster's website, and it's just tons of lesson plans, and they all fit the education standards, which it's not my field, so I don't know, but just a lot of really exciting lesson plans for history and social studies and English teachers to use in the classroom. So I think that's probably the closest we'll get to a digitized version.
I think it's a great book for our bicentennial year, having this book available. And it sounds like from the foods that you left out, that there could be a second printing of another chapter, of another book of another 14. But I've often wondered, is there an Alabama State food, like there's an Alabama State bird, the yellowhammer, or just is there a state food officially?
I guess I don't know the answer to that. I know there's an Alabama State fruit, which is the blackberry. There's an Alabama State tree fruit, which is the peach. There's the state cake, which is the Lane cake. Do you know, Scotty, if there's an Alabama? There's not. Okay, I didn't think so. So, yeah, but that's an interesting idea to think about what that would be if we had to choose. It would be a fight, is what it would be.
Is chicken stew the same thing as camp stew?
No, it's different. I don't remember exactly what the ingredients of camp stew are, but I remember when I was researching that it was distinctly different from chicken stew.
Camp stew has pork in it.
Yeah, and these stews in North Alabama, they also used to make goat stew with the same ingredients, but they don't do it as much now, of course, because fewer people have goats and it's really labor intensive. But it's tomatoes, and they use potatoes as a thickener instead of flour.
Do you talk about the importance of the dinner table, gathering at the table, and the foods that
we as Southerners and specifically Alabamians, when we think about a Sunday dinner or a holiday dinner, what do we expect to see on the table?
Yeah, a little
Everybody has their
bit.
favorites, and they get disappointed if that particular food's not on the table.
That's it. Yeah, that's sort of woven. I don't think there's a particular chapter about that, but that's woven throughout, especially in the introduction to the book, which talks about hospitality, that great Southern construct. And particularly when I talk about dinner on the ground, which is a part of Decoration Day, but also church homecomings and other Appalachian events where certain people are known for making and bringing certain things. And some of the dinners on the grounds would get real competitive. The women would compete against each other to see who would eat the most of what they brought. And so those kinds of stories are definitely in there, yeah. And Eugene Walter, who was from Mobile and did a lot of food writing, he was just sort of a Renaissance man. He did a lot of everything. He talked a lot about that in his writing, and so I tried to pull some of his quotes in as well.
Okay, two things. How do you pronounce your name again?
It's pronounced Blejwas.
Blejwas.
Blejwas, yes, is Polish, but it's unusual even for a Polish name, I'm told.
And maybe you addressed this and I missed it, but how did you arrive at 14?
I don't know.
15, 20, 12?
I don't have a good answer for that at all. But what was so strange is that when I was first doing this book, I read a book by Susan Tucker. Well, it was an edited volume by Susan Tucker, who's in New Orleans. And it's sort of a similar concept. But she also had 14. It was like the New Orleans cuisine, and I just realized it the other day that she ended up at 14 too. So there must be something magical about that number, but I don't know. Yes. All the notes are at the. Oh no! I think they're at the back of each chapter. I think maybe they're all at the back of the book, but they're broken by chapter, so you won't see them along the bottom of the page, but you'll see them all in the back. And the book also includes a section called "Suggestions for Further Reading" that's broken down by chapter, because there was so much, like I said, that I wanted to include that I had to leave out. So, there's a whole great article about the girls' tomato clubs, So if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can learn a little bit more.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Can y'all join me again in thanking?
Thank you. It's so fun to be here. Thank you.
And once again, her book is available for purchase just right out in the lobby, and she'll be here if you have any other questions for her, and I'm sure she'd be more than happy to sign a book for you.
Yes, and this is my website address, and there is a contact button on that, and I will get your message and I will respond to you. So if you think of anything later, you want to reach out, please don't hesitate. Thank you. You can come up. Thank you.